Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this PEI open house. Good afternoon, good morning, or evening to everyone who's joining from different places in the world. My name is Katie Ruland, and I'm a research fellow and co-director of the Center for Social Protection at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. And I'm also a member of PEI's Advisory Council. And as such, it's my honor and my pleasure to be moderating this session today. And today we'll be talking about coaching for economic inclusion. And we have a great lineup with 4 fantastic speakers hearing about experiences from 3 different countries. Before we get started, I'd like to remind us of a few housekeeping rules, and that's because we would like to make these conversations as interactive and engaging as possible. And so for that, I would first like to ask you if you could introduce yourselves in the chat box. So if you could include your name and where you work, who you work with. It's always really nice to know who is in the room. And also, as we are going along through the presentations, feel free to immediately put your questions into the chat box that we can then pose to the speakers, either immediately after their presentation or in the Q&A afterwards. A second point of housekeeping is that there is simultaneous interpretation during all presentations and during this whole session to Arabic, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and English. And to turn that on, please click on the globe icon that's in the bottom of your screen in the Zoom platform, and that allows you to choose the preferred language that you would like to use for today's session. Now, please do click on this now because the last presentation is going to be in Spanish. And if you select this now, it will be as smooth as possible. So with those housekeeping announcements out of the way, let's focus on what we're going to discuss today. So for those of you who don't know PEI Open House yet, if it's your first time, a very warm welcome. But in these sessions, we bring together global and country experts on strategic thinking around economic inclusion programming, and also different innovations across countries and interventions. Today is the last session of the calendar year 2022, but there will be a new session in February 2023. So please look out for the next one as we start the new year. Before we do that, in the meantime, in this session, we will discuss coaching, the coaching components in economic inclusion programs, and how it enables poor and vulnerable populations to take part in the intervention, but also reap the benefits from the various components and elements that are provided through those interventions. Now, coaching has become incredibly popular. It can currently be found in almost all economic inclusion programs. 90% of all interventions include coaches. And these coaches are typically community members or program employees. And they do home visits, or they guide savings groups or other groups on a regular basis. They check in with them on their well-being, but also their economic activities. And crucially, they provide encouragement and support as participants navigate their way throughout the program and their income-generating activities. Now, a rapidly growing evidence base shows that coaching can really enhance program impact. It helps individuals to build skills, to build confidence and self-esteem, and to connect to others in the community. And this all helps to move out of poverty. Equally, there are also lots of questions about how coaching can be done or should be done for different populations in different contexts, what different kinds of models exist, but also how to strike the balance between serving large populations and going to scale, as well as offering depth of support that would make this component as effective as possible. So today we're going to be covering all this and more, and we'll learn about design and implementation of coaching components in 3 different countries, namely in Rwanda, India, and Peru. And I will introduce each of the speakers before I'm inviting them to present on their particular intervention. Before I do that, I will hand over the floor to Janet from PEI, who is going to provide a brief framing presentation to tell us a bit more about what coaching looks like and how it's included in various economic inclusion programs. So Janet, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Katie, and welcome everyone. We thought before we got into some of the case studies that we'll be hearing from today, it might be helpful to look at a few definitions to get ourselves speaking on the same page, using the same language, to look at the landscape of coaching in economic inclusion programs, and to consider some of the design elements that you'll hear about in the programs and that are critical for people to understand before or as they are designing coaching strategies. So first, we'll look at coaching versus training. Very similar, sometimes both part of an economic inclusion program. Coaching really is designed to deliver regular support to participant households to help them to build their confidence, as well as to achieve their ultimate goals and objectives. Whereas training is really designed to transfer knowledge around specific topics. And the real key distinction here is the length of time. Coaching typically takes place across the course of the project lifetime. The visits could be weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, at the household, at the enterprise, etc. But it's really an integrated approach. Whereas training tends to be one-off sessions, perhaps with refresher training as well. But the distinctions get a little more nuanced when we look at coaching versus mentoring. And very often people use this term interchangeably, but there are important distinctions here. Mentoring typically focuses on the livelihood activity. So it focuses on the experience of the mentor implementing that activity and utilizing that knowledge to guide the participant through that process. Coaching does also focus on the livelihood activity quite intensively often, but it goes beyond that. It focuses on other elements of the program and other elements of the participant's life in order to sort of free up some of the constraints that have traditionally sort of prevented people from moving forward. And it's designed to draw on the existing knowledge, skills, and experience that the participant brings to the work, and that experience and knowledge which is gained throughout the course of the work. So important distinctions, and it'll be interesting to listen for these distinctions as we listen to our three speakers today as well. If we look at coaching in economic inclusion programs and some of the evidence, there are relatively few studies that focus exclusively on coaching or on coaching specific impact on participants. But overall, we understand that coaching is considered to play a key role in the effectiveness of economic inclusion programs. And it plays quite a specific role in some ways. It is the one component that focuses quite deliberately on the internal constraints faced by participants. So the confidence building, the aspiration focusing, these are really important elements that coaching focuses on in the program. And these sorts of activities and these sorts of elements of the program can bring about behavior change. And behavior change, when it's coupled with some of the economic components that economic inclusion programs include as well, can really have lasting and increased impact. Now, we know that these efforts are labor intensive. They're high intensity kinds of activities. So some of the evidence has focused on ways to make these things more cost effective. And one way is through group coaching. And group coaching is interesting because it obviously it does make elements more cost effective, but it also brings about then an opportunity to discuss community norms, social norms, etc. We'll hear a little bit more about that sort of strategy as well from some of our speakers. Now, if we look at the global data, PEI's landscape data on economic inclusion programs, as Katie mentioned, overwhelmingly programs are using this. Both government and non-government led are focusing on coaching activities, mostly to guide livelihood activities and to sort of smooth the process of participants as they move through the program activities, etc. But if you look to the right, there are other coaching topics that programs indicate that they support, from social issues to health and nutrition, job placement, etc. Over 60% of programs deliver coaching through community structures like savings groups or community-based volunteers. Listen for that from our speakers today as well. Relatively few are utilizing digital technology. So almost half of non-government programs feature coaching through digital training, but only 17% of government programs. Now, finally, there are a number of design considerations. These are contextualized programs, as Katie mentioned, as you're working in different contexts, in different countries, the coaching component will change and shift, especially when you think about scale. The coaching profile is important to consider. Sometimes you have options and sometimes there are very few options for who delivers the coaching mechanism, whether it's a government staff member, a community-based volunteer. Understanding what education profile you can reasonably expect from this individual, and then what capacity building you'll need to do to help them effectively deliver the program. Content considerations are really important. Some of our coaches in some programs do a lot of referring to other programs, training sessions here, government programs there. So that's a different profile than in a context where those services don't exist, and the coach will actually have to deliver some of the training content, etc. And the delivery considerations are also key. How often will they visit? How long in the program? And importantly, what is the caseload that each of those coaches will undertake? Some of that has to do with the geographic density of your population, but there are other considerations as well. So listen out for some of the design considerations that our panelists will speak about today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janet. That's a really helpful framing, and I think really useful to understand how coaching is integrated in interventions, but also different from training and mentoring. As you say, these terms are often used interchangeably. So I think this sets the scene very well for what the landscape looks like, as well as some of the big debates in how to frame and implement coaching. And on that note, let's move to the first country presentation and hear about what happens in practice. And I'm very pleased to introduce Miss Claudine Niwagagaga from Rwanda. She is Director General for Local Administrative Entities Development Agency, or LODA. And she will speak to coaching as part of Rwanda's economic inclusion efforts. Miss Claudine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I hope you are seeing my screen.
Yes, we can see your screen.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm going to talk about the graduation strategy and the role of parasocial workers in coaching, and actually in providing and enable the participants to the program to graduate from poverty. And first, I would like to share some key shifts in our new graduation strategy that was approved by the cabinet recently, 3 weeks ago. The first thing is that this is involving the whole government, not only the Ministry of Local Government and LODA as the implementers of social protection programs, but the whole government, so that we ensure the complementarity and multi-sectoral undertaking. The second shift is that our beneficiaries are no longer called beneficiaries, they are participants, they are partners to ensure their role and participation in the graduation. The third element shift is the enabling environment, that conducive environment that actually ensures that all conditions are met so that the participants to the programs graduate from poverty. The fourth element in the key shifts is the holistic package of services, so that we ensure that we have a comprehensive package that provides a useful package
I think PEI colleagues, I think there might be a glitch with Claudine's connection. Is that correct?
Yes, it seems so.
That's very unfortunate. It looks like she's dropped off for the moment. In that case, shall we, for the moment, move to the next presentation? And this comes a bit earlier than you might be expecting, Koushik, but I hope you are ready to take this opportunity to speak about the Jharkhand program. So Our second presenter, and I'm sure we'll come back to Ms. Claudine when she's back, is Kaushik Roy, and he is State Program Manager for Jharkhand program with Trickle Up in India. And we will hear more from him about how house coaching is implemented within their intervention. Kaushik, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody who has joined this beautiful session. So initially, I will start with a brief intro about Trickle Up. So at Trickle Up, we invest in women living in extreme poverty as they create sustainable livelihoods and change the lives of their families and communities. We train them to start businesses and save money for the future. In the process, they gain confidence and find their voice. For over 40 years, we have been supporting women to forge resilient pathways out of poverty. And with our partners, we are on the track to reach 5 million people by 2030. So like in Jharkhand, this is one of the state of India. We are partnering with the State Livelihood Professional Society. So I will give you a brief overview about this organization. So Jharkhand State Livelihood Promotion Society is an autonomous organization under the Rural Development Department of the Government of Jharkhand, created to serve as a special purpose vehicle for smooth implementation of poverty reduction schemes and programs in the state. It works as a nodal agency for effective implementation of livelihood promotion in the state, and also a nodal agency for implementation of the National Rural Livelihood Mission projects in the state of Jharkhand. JSLPS aims to alleviate poverty in all forms in the state, especially among the marginalized groups, which include PBTGs, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and people living in ultra poverty in general. To address these abysmal poverty levels experienced by PBTGs who have been historically deprived and have been remained at the bottom of development pyramid, JSLPS established a special cell for the PBTGs and ultra poor development. Next, please. So now we will give a brief background about these particular vulnerable tribal groups whom with we are working, and this whole initiative and the partnership between the JSLPS and Trickle Up have been. So these particularly vulnerable tribal groups constitute the most vulnerable tribal groups among those designated as scheduled tribes and largely resided in isolated, remote, and difficult to reach areas in small scattered habitats. Their communities are marked by a pre-agricultural level of technology, stagnant or declining population growth, extremely low level of literacy, and a subsistence level of economy. Cue the next, please. So JSLPS has been in partnership with Trickle Up since 2015 and has worked with JSLPS to enable their programs and schemes to reach those who are at the greatest risk of getting left behind. So in 2015, both the organizations, we established the graduation approach within the framework of National Rural Livelihood Mission. There is the mission driven by the Rural Development Department, Government of India. In 2017, we increased our focus on the inclusion of families in ultra poverty in social and financial domains and developed a replicable model across NRLM. In 2022, the recent partnership that we had with JSLPS, Trickle Up and JSLPS are scaling up their intervention to further strengthen inclusion and welfare of the ultra poor participants, including PBTG communities within the framework of NRLM, by promoting more sustainable livelihoods and connecting them with the existing markets, strengthening the capacity of the 300 PBTG change makers to deliver high quality services, and enhancing data-driven decision-making for overall improvement of program quality. Next, please. So as a part of our implementation strategy, we provide implementation support in specific livelihood activities to enable households to graduate out of extreme poverty and ensure the sustainability of their income. We work with the PBTG change makers, the frontline groups of JSLPS, to develop their skills and capacities on coaching and mentoring so that they can better support the PBTG families. We develop learning systems with JSLPS to support the management decision-making process to improve the quality of deliverables. We document and disseminate the best practices and learnings from our intervention in Jharkhand with JSLPS and other relevant stakeholders to explore the scope of evidence-based replication. Next, please. So the PBTG change makers, who are the frontline cadres of JSLPS, are the interested youth from the same community who assist in village level interventions with the vision to see their own community overcome ultra poverty and should at least have attained middle school education. And some of these basic responsibilities of the change makers are to collect the socioeconomic status of the PBTG household by conducting household level survey, facilitate PBTG families to avail all entitlements ensured by the government, form SHGs and attend all the SHG meetings in their area, and motivate the PBTG families to become active members of these SHGs. They are basically the savings groups. Assist in solving the problem of the PBTG communities on health, hygiene, nutrition, and education by generating awareness among the families. Inspire and encourage the PBTG families to participate in village assemblies. The change makers train the PBTG communities on livelihood interventions like agriculture, livestock, and micro-enterprise, and guide them to non-timber forest produce value chain and engage all of them in intensive livelihood activities. Next, please. So to coach and mentor the change makers from PBTG communities, we customize training that will enable them to develop soft skills or life skills. This will help them to engage with the community and better communicate, mobilize, and generate awareness on livelihood planning processes, income generating activities, and learn new coaching and mentoring techniques. We train the change makers on the usage of technology for helping the participants through digital advisory mobile application on livelihood practices for enhancing and diversifying their livelihood activities. We train the JSLPS change makers and JSLPS staffs on tools for recording and retrieving data that tracks the progress of the PBTG change makers and participants towards graduation so that the change makers can provide quality coaching services to the households. This has also helped to improve the decision-making process of JSLPS management at different levels. In order to grade and monitor the performance of the change makers, we define key performance indicators for the PBTG change makers to be measured for monitoring the quality of services. We develop PBTG change makers performance monitoring framework and tools, conduct baseline video documentation of PBTG change makers to enable a systematic way of recording and analyzing the life of the PBTG change makers, which will help in identifying improvement opportunities and further planning the series of capacity building initiatives for the PBTG change makers. To improve the quality of intervention by JSLPS, Trickle has undertaken a detailed analysis of the MIS data for effective program monitoring and quality decision making. We have reviewed the databases and developed prototypes for possible digital solutions. We have suggested the improvement areas for the entire system of data collection by the PBTG change makers. Next, please. So it had been a long journey since 2015, and we are still in partnership with JSLPS. There has been many learnings, but to just mention a few, like we would like to, it is also important for like-minded organizations who are engaging in the implementation of similar programs with governments to understand the context, background, and need of the communities. In the primary stage, a proper system and process needs to be developed to recognize the coaches. This is one of the important aspects, that we need to recognize the right coaches. It is really important to build the vision of the coaches to help them along the process of change and take ownership of the community development. Prior to the engagement process, it is also crucial to have an in-depth analysis of the capacity building needs of the cadres of coaches and an assessment of the resource required for developing them. Contextually appropriate capacity building of the frontline coaches is key so that they can adapt, adopt, and further build the confidence and aspirations of the participants. And also we need to advocate for a proven model that has created an impact in the same context and rationalize the scope of scaling up. Next, please. So extending further support, JSLPS, I think, is very keen and in a position to extend further enablement support to PBTGs. They have set up a special production cell exclusively, as I mentioned earlier, for PBTs and ultra pro development. JSLPS has also designed a comprehensive development project, UDANs, exclusively for the PBTGs, and which is approved by the Empowered Committee of NRLM under the chairmanship of the Secretary, Department of Rural Development, Government of India. So in the present phase that the partnership we're having in JSLPS, they have targeted approximately 24,000 PBTG families in 11 districts, which is only 1/3 of the total population of PBTGs. There are around 70,000 PBTG families with a population of 0.31 million. So JSLPS is very keen, as I said, to scale up the program across the state with the help of a cadre of trained PBTG change makers by Trickle Up, who will act as para-professionals and bridge the gap between the administration and the PBTG community. So last but not the least, there is also a political will in the state of Jharkhand to address immense scope and clear needs of the PBTG families. So thank you. That's from my.
Kaushik, thank you very much for that really interesting presentation and also keeping to time. It's always a nice combination if the two come together like this. And hearing your presentation, it strikes me, as it often does when I hear about coaching and economic inclusion programs, exactly how much coaches do and the breadth of their work. They are enumerators doing survey work, they are trainers, and they're also motivational coaches. Now, you mentioned the importance of capacity building, and I'm going to use my prerogative as moderator here to ask one question before we move back to Claudine for her presentation. To pick up on the issue of capacity, so that there's capacity building, but taking a step back, what are the capacity requirements for staff to become coaches or change makers? And what are the incentives in place for those coaches in their jobs?
So basically, like just as I mentioned you, that our coaches in this JSLPS intervention, they are the community coaches. So they are the community cadres. So they are from the same community. So definitely building the capacity of these community coaches, it's not the staffs. And particularly in case of PBTGs, what we have observed that since they are very much introvert and they don't mingle with other communities, so selecting the coaches from the same community works. And definitely we have seen that these coaches initially, after getting these numerous types of trainings on capacity building, on soft skills, on some technical trainings, they have really performed well, and they are slowly performing well. And in regard to the incentives that you're talking about, like definitely, we have the JSLPS has not come up with such ideas of giving extra incentives, but definitely they are being paid for a particular job. But it's our role to build the ownership. So basically our focus is to build the ownership within this change makers who belong to the same community, so that they can take the role, they can play the role of like leadership, and in future they can become the community leaders. So in that fashion, we stress much more on the soft skills part rather than the technical part, because technical part, we have seen that cadres, they adapt and adopt the technical part, but they lack the soft skills, especially in case of the PBTGs. So our much more focus on building the capacity of the community cadres on soft skills. And really we have seen that these things are working. They're understanding that why they are as change makers, why have they have been selected as coaches, what is their role, and how they can bring a change in their community. So that is giving an immense satisfaction to these local cadres. So I hope I answered your question.
Yes, and I think it will also spark more conversation at the end of this session after all three presentations. I can see questions in the chat already about how coaching element can be sustained after the program ends. And so what you said about community champions and empowerment for them to take it further is really interesting. But before we continue with that conversation, I would like to see if we can bring Ms. Claudine back for her presentation on Rwanda. And maybe we can start with the first slide that she was presenting on when she sadly dropped. I cannot see the full list of participants on my screen, so I hope she's back and able to pick up her presentation.
Thank you, Kerry. I'm back, and I'm sorry for the poor connection. Starting where I was explaining the shifts, the main shifts in the new graduation that has been approved, I was also explaining that we put emphasis on the protection against shocks, something that was not there before in our social protection programs. And of course, learning from the experience and being able to provide adaptation so that our programs really address issues around poverty. If we continue with the following slide, what are the key pillars of the graduation strategy? Next slide. The first one will be to provide sustainable income, the income transfers to our program participants using safety nets so that we ensure that we provide the foundation of to secure living. Then the second pillar being the sustainable livelihoods enhancement through productive assets, skills transfers, insurance, etc., in order to ensure that we help to put our program participants with necessary pathway to livelihood sustainability. Then the third element being the complementary services. In some cases, we have been observing that when they cannot access to the accompaniment, when they lack accessibility to water, to key infrastructure, then they cannot get out of poverty, they cannot graduate. So that is to ensure accessibility to services for sustainable living. Then the fourth element, the fourth pillar is the conducive environment through the provision of key infrastructure elements like accessibility to markets, to roads, to land, to electricity, to water, so that we ensure that the context allows sustainable livelihoods for them to flourish. The fifth pillar of the graduation is to understand our clients and to enable them, they become really participants to their graduation. The sixth pillar is to ensure that we align the policies and institutional arrangements, that is the governance framework, etc., so that we ensure that the approach is multi-sectoral. I explained in the beginning that this is for the whole government as well as key stakeholders in social protection. Then the seventh element is the M&E, lesson learning and adaptive management. And there we have the parasocial workers. We have also the data through social registry, the monitoring and evaluation, really to ensure that the programs are well implemented and they are achieving the necessary results. And here we talk about the mindset transformation, being able to provide supplements of services, really tracking the progress, etc. So now, when Janet was introducing, I was really interested to understand the difference between the coaching, mentorship, the training, and our parasocial workers, if we consider the case study of parasocial workers, are playing that role of coaches and mentors. The graduation program that is implemented across different countries use social workers, the case workers. And in Rwanda, we were already using the case workers under the minimum package for graduation. And actually, the case workers bring in complementary services in terms of training, coaching, and mentorship. If we consider their, for instance, what is the profile of the parasocial workers that we are putting in place in Rwanda, the most important element, in addition to the minimum level of education, if we can move to the following slide. So in addition to being able to read, to write, having the minimum education, it is very important that they have life experience of success. They can be considered as model, the role model in their communities. It is very important that they live in the same community, in the same village. Very important that they work as volunteers, then the honesty, the integrity, the respect, very important for them to be committed, to have the necessary energy, to be the influencers. Of course, it's necessary to have the capacity so that they do the work, they monitor the service, etc. And of course, provide facilitation, communication, and mentorship. These are the skills that we are providing with them so that they do the work. Currently, we have over 14,000 parasocial workers at grassroots level. They have essential knowledge and they are equipped. They receive communication allowance and facilitation twice a year. If we move to the following slide, that is to share mainly key tasks, and as you can see, the most important is to be the coach, to be the mentors, to really ensure that they provide a necessary accompaniment to the program participants so that they enable them to understand what they shall do, and they help them to resolve. The members are facing some issues. They also provide them with advice on how to manage the social protection support they are getting for holders, NGOs. The parasocial key data in terms of the targeting, but also we involve them in the monitor of the graduation. They are also responsible for reporting and ensuring the network. My last slide will talk about the graduation element that has been approved by the cabinet with the key components regarding the sustainable livelihood enhancement, where we do provide asset transfers, skills development, and of course the important role of the parasocial workers. And of course we aim at bringing in more skills to empower and build the capacity of parasocial workers, making sure that the graduation components work together, and putting in place a monitoring and evaluation system, providing necessary trainings so that the graduation strategy is understood at all levels, from the central and most importantly at local level, because they live with the program participants, involving key stakeholders, including development partners, NGOs, civil society organizations, so that they really they have the ownership of the graduation strategy, and they use the graduation strategy model across all programs. So this is what I had to share with you. Of course, this is a very short time, and I'm available for additional comments, feedback, questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Claudine. I'm really happy that you were able to give us this presentation on the coaching within your work in Rwanda, and really interesting to hear about your model of parasocial workers. Again, I will use the privilege to ask one question before we move into the third presentation. And my question actually has two components to it. First of all, since the model is based on parasocial workers working voluntarily, albeit with some incentives, Are there any challenges recruiting those workers, especially as there are quite some skills required and there's quite a large list of activities that they're asked to do? So I was wondering whether you have any challenges with recruitment. And linked to that as well, also picking up on a question that's in the chat box, I imagine that working with voluntary parasocial workers allows you to work at scale. You have more than 14,000 of those workers. But is there a trade-off between working with voluntary workers versus maybe those who are more skilled or better paid and who can do this as a full-time job? So back to you if you would wish to give some short reflections to this twofold question.
Thank you so much. Perhaps the context in Rwanda, given that our country went through some hard times in the past, the genocide, that actually, of course, it is very bad to experience a genocide, but actually it had some positive consequences on the voluntarism. And so we had many people who volunteered to participate to the reconstruction of the country. And of course, that helps us to develop the voluntary workers. That's why we didn't experience many challenges in recruiting the parasocial workers. That is one. Second, we have also a chance that the country is small, so it is very easy, the communication, but also putting in place some key tools and ensure that key stakeholders are involved and they have that ownership. So that is to say that for existing let's say international NGOs, civil society organizations who have their own community volunteers who are better paid, we are inviting them to go through our existing parasocial workers so that it helps us to empower those parasocial workers, and we avoid to have parallel structures that can contradict sometimes. So when we have one structure being used by different stakeholders, the capacity building becomes easier, less costly, and of course, the work is done by that person and they are more capacitated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure we'll be coming back to this later on. But now I would like to invite our third speaker, Mr. Carlos Figueroa. He is head of management for the productive project units for the Fund for Social Development, or FONCODES, in Peru. And as a reminder, Carlos will be speaking in Spanish. So if you would like to make use of simultaneous translation, you can do so by clicking on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom screen, and you can select the preferred language. And I can see that you're already sharing your screen, Carlos, and now moving towards your presentation, I'm sure.
Muy buenos días con todos y todas. No he tenido problemas con mi cámara, así que estoy compartiendo mi cámara del teléfono. Tengo dificultades para compartir la presentación. Voy a intentar nuevamente hacerlo. Si me dan un par de segundos, por favor. ¿Se ve? ¿Me confirman si se ve, por favor?
Sí, se ve perfecto.
Muchas gracias. Bien, yo voy a hablarles un poco del programa que tenemos en Perú, que es un programa presupuestal que está orientado al acceso a hogares rurales con economías de subsistencia a mercados locales. ¿Eso qué quiere decir? Que estamos orientados dentro del marco de un grupo objetivo o familias que tienen un perfil que están ligadas a una determinada posición socioeconómica que es la más débil de todo el eslabón que existe en la agricultura familiar de nuestro país. Nuestra política de desarrollo e inclusión social al 2030 tiene 5 ejes. Entonces voy a ubicar un poco en qué nivel de eje está nuestro programa. El primer eje está orientado básicamente al grupo etario entre 0 a 3 años, que está ligado a la nutrición infantil. Para eso se atiende con un programa específico que se llama Cuna Más. Tenemos otro de 0 a 5 años que también ve el tema de desarrollo infantil temprano, de 6 a 17 años, que es el desarrollo integral de la niñez y la modernidad. Por eso tenemos dos grupos, dos programas, uno Cali Walma de alimentación escolar y Juntos, que es un programa también que atiende a las familias y brinda recursos para que puedan tener acceso a alimentación y necesidades básicas. En el eje 4, que es inclusión económica, tentativamente un grupo etario de 18 a 64 años, que es más o menos la PEA que tenemos en el Perú, pero no es limitativo, porque acá en el país tenemos también familias que son emancipadas con personas de 14, 15 años, o también personas adultas que están en proceso de mantenimiento de actividad económica mayores de 64 años. Y tenemos un programa en el eje 5, que es protección de adulto mayor, que tiene un programa Pensión 65. Nosotros nos vamos a centrar en este eje 4, que es donde está nuestro desarrollo del programa. Quiero precisarles que las familias a las que nosotros nos estamos dedicando con este programa son familias de la agricultura familiar de subsistencia, que en nuestro país se encuentran en las zonas más alejadas, con difícil conectividad, con difícil de acceso a recursos como recursos hídricos, difícil conectividad tanto vial como digital. Entonces, digamos que es en nuestro país le llamamos, están en la punta del cerro y en el medio de la selva. Y básicamente esos son nuestros grandes bolsones a donde estamos nosotros apuntando para poder desarrollar este programa. Nuestro programa tiene una duración de 3 años y acá yo les presento nuestra cadena de valor muy resumida para que de alguna manera tengan un poco idea dónde entra nuestro proceso con nuestros yachachis, que vamos a decir son nuestra columna vertebral del programa de la transmisión de conocimiento, de capacidades, de competencias, etc. Nuestro programa contribuye a la inclusión económica de los hogares rurales en economías de subsistencia. O sea, estamos contribuyendo a la mejora de la inclusión económica de estas familias a través de 2 productos que tenemos en el programa. El primer producto está ligado a que las parcelas productivas y las viviendas de las personas mejoren sus condiciones de producción, productividad, calidad, pero así también mejore las condiciones de vida actuales a las que se encuentran. Normalmente en estas zonas nosotros tenemos personas que viven dentro de sus mismas viviendas con cocinas que emanan humo tóxico dentro de la misma vivienda en horas donde la familia está también en la vivienda, los niños, etcétera, y eso implica que haya una suerte de enfermedades respiratorias bastante graves. Adicionalmente, en estas zonas normalmente no tenemos acceso a agua potable, entonces en los mejores sitios tienen agua entubada, que significa conectar a un riachuelo o una acequia con agua no tratada, pero en la mayoría de casos simplemente recipientes, contenedores con agua que no es saludable, y eso genera mucha enfermedad gastrointestinal en los niños. Y adicionalmente a su parcela integral con el manejo de sus productos agropecuarios. El producto 2 ya es el que está ligado a emprendimientos rurales inclusivos. ¿Eso qué quiere decir? Negocios que se desarrollan en la ruralidad, pero que no necesariamente son negocios agropecuarios, no necesariamente. Pueden ser de servicios, de bienes, etcétera, y en general lo que genere dinámica económica. Para eso nosotros desarrollamos un conjunto de actividades que son la asistencia técnica participativa, para poder desarrollar todo este programa. ¿Qué implica asistencia técnica participativa? Una de las características de nuestro programa es que no es un enlatado, o sea, no lleva un paquete de tecnología, no lleva un paquete de cosas para que las personas las implementen. Cada uno de nuestros proyectos que se desarrolla en cada comunidad se desarrolla de manera conjunta con cada una de las familias para que en base a sus necesidades, sus potencialidades, etcétera, pueda empezar a desarrollar una intervención dentro de su parcela, dentro de dentro de sus activos productivos que tiene y de su vivienda, para que mejore sus condiciones de vida y adicionalmente pueda generar capacidades que le permitan desarrollar competencias que vayan más allá de la condición en la que se encuentran en este momento. Una de las condiciones claves que tenemos que cambiar, y esto es parte del trabajo que nosotros hacemos durante los 3 años, es cambiar un chip de resignación que tienen estas familias porque se sienten que nunca han sido atendidas por el Estado, si el Estado ha entrado de manera incipiente o tangencial, para que ellos mismos se conviertan en actores de desarrollo capaces de poder mejorar sus condiciones de vida, acceder al mercado y fortalecer sus condiciones. Y esto implica también que nosotros trabajemos con ellos en la implementación de módulos productivos. Estos módulos productivos no son módulos demostrativos familiares dentro de la misma parcela, donde cada uno de ellos va a aprender el manejo de las tecnologías, entrenamiento y capacitación y acompañamiento técnico, productivo y económico para que puedan insertarse al mercado, principalmente a los mercados locales, convirtiéndose en actores dinámicos de la economía local. Y la implementación de emprendimientos rurales por grupos de interés, que implica que no va a ser una implementación individualizada, sino a través de un grupo de familias, metiendo ya la semilla de la asociatividad base de la, digamos, de la dinámica que va a permitirles a ellos a ser competitivos. Solos pueden llegar rápido, juntos llegan lejos, es lo que siempre les decimos, para ir incentivándolos y sobre todo este proceso se da de una manera que permite que ellos vean que pares de ellos han logrado desarrollo con esta intervención. ¿Cuál es la base central de este tema? La base central de este tema es que ellos mismos son los actores del desarrollo de sus actividades. Y ¿cuál es la otra base primordial y fuerte? Es que FONCODES tiene un proceso robusto de supervisión para que este proceso, durante los 3 años que dura la intervención con cada uno de los hogares, puedan pasar por 3 etapas básicas que podrían ser la primaria, la secundaria y la superior, para poder desarrollar sus actividades productivas con mejora de condiciones de vida y con desarrollo de negocios rurales inclusivos. Para eso nosotros tenemos un modelo de gestión y el modelo de gestión se llama el núcleo ejecutor. Eso nos permite que el mismo grupo humano que vamos a intervenir es el mismo grupo que desarrolla el proyecto, participa en el diseño y es el que conduce la ejecución. Eso quiere decir en buen romance que nosotros le damos los recursos a ellos para que ellos mismos los administren. Claro, dentro de un marco de normas y procedimientos que establece FONCODES y que lo supervisa para que la orientación de los recursos se dé exclusivamente para los fines para los que ha sido destinado, el desarrollo de sus proyectos que ha sido participativamente desarrollado con ellos. Son responsables de la administración, de la toma de decisiones, de la vigilancia, pero en el marco de los procedimientos de FONCODES y supervisado por FONCODES. Promueve la participación de la población porque están sujetos a rendiciones de cuentas públicas para que puedan rendir ante los usuarios cómo se está haciendo el uso de los recursos. Y adicionalmente tienen que hacer rendición de cuentas administrativas ante FONCODES de manera mensual. Y los recursos se van orientando y destinando a este tema. ¿Esto qué implica? Que nosotros estamos desarrollando capacidades con cada uno de los integrantes de este núcleo ejecutor, o usuarios o beneficiarios que forman parte de este núcleo ejecutor en sus condiciones productivas, individuales, mejora de condiciones de vida, pero también estamos generando capacidades de gestión en un grupo de estas personas que es el que comienza a manejar un proyecto que aproximadamente es de $900,000, que es lo que tienen que administrar durante 3 años. Este grupo tiene 4, digamos, pilares importantes de actores, ¿no? Son los representantes del núcleo ejecutor, que es el grupo el que dirige, es un presidente, un secretario, un tesorero y un fiscal, que son elegidos los 3 primeros por la misma población, y el fiscal es designado por el alcalde de la municipalidad distrital, que el distrito es digamos, el espacio más pequeño que tenemos nosotros formal dentro de la división política del país. Y entonces, bajo ese esquema y con la supervisión de FONCODES es que se tiene este círculo virtuoso. Tenemos a los usuarios que son actores clave. Si ellos no ejecutan las acciones que tienen que desarrollar a través del proceso de capacitación que se les va a dar, que está en función del pilar central que son estos yachachis, este proyecto no va a funcionar, porque esto solo funciona si los actores principales, los usuarios, se ponen las pilas, se comprometen y desarrollan las actividades de cambio que se les van enseñando para mejorar todo lo que les hemos indicado. Y tendremos también al coordinador del núcleo ejecutor. El coordinador del núcleo ejecutor es un profesional contratado por el núcleo ejecutor con un perfil necesario para que sea jefe de proyecto. Y lo central que les decía, que son los yachaches, que son los responsables de la capacitación, del desarrollo de capacidades y el fortalecimiento de competencias que tienen que tener estas personas para poder enfrentarse a esta nueva dinámica o nueva visión de la dinámica económica local y la importancia de su participación en este contexto. Entonces, el yachachi, ya entrando de lleno a lo que nos trae en el punto, es el eje clave de esto. ¿Qué es el yachachi? El yachachi que es un campesino de la misma zona de intervención que en idioma quechua significa el que sabe y enseña. ¿Eso qué quiere decir? Que él emplea un proceso de capacitación horizontal. O sea, él no es jefe del campesino y le dice al campesino que haga las cosas como él le dice. Todo lo contrario, él trabaja con el campesino en la misma parcela, en sus mismas viviendas, indicándole y trabajando con él, metiendo la mano junto con él para decirle
Sorry,
cómo
Carlos,
tiene que
sorry
hacer
to
las
interrupt
cosas.
you. I'm just going to ask those who are not speaking or translating to please mute your microphone.
I don't understand, please.
Carlos, please continue.
Ok, no sé desde dónde estoy o retrocedo un poco. ¿Me comentan? ¿Continúo?
From the same slide, that's fine.
Perfecto. Como les decía, entonces, el yachachi es el elemento central, que no es jerárquico, sino es horizontal. Es el que sabe y enseña bajo la metodología de aprender haciendo. Pero así como sabe y enseña, también capta información y capacidades y tecnologías que pueden estar desarrollando de manera ancestral a algunos de los usuarios, y eso también lo comparte con otros o mejora las condiciones en las que se están haciendo para poder mejorar. Hay varias situaciones tecnológicas simples, básicas, que no son aplicadas de manera adecuada y que no permiten mejorar, incrementar la producción, la productividad y la calidad de productos. Y sobre todo, toda la intervención que nosotros hacemos es inducida a que sea cero pesticidas, cero agroquímicos. Todo se hace con abonos y abonos foliares, abonos naturales y también con biocidas. Entonces, es una agricultura sana. Y lo que tratamos de hacer es que con este proceso se genere el mantenimiento de la biodiversidad para que ellos puedan tener acceso a alimentos diversificados y poder generar excedentes que puedan llevar al mercado local para Bien, ¿ahora me escuchan?
Sí,
¿Me escuchan? Ya.
sí,
Ok.
sí.
Entonces, lo que les decía es que justamente el yachachi es el elemento central principal que de manera horizontal traslada conocimientos, capacidades y fortalece las competencias de estos usuarios para que puedan desarrollar esto de manera, digamos, a través de un círculo virtuoso, aprender haciendo en la misma parcela, en la misma vivienda de cada uno de los usuarios. La metodología que se emplea es una metodología de campesino a campesino, a través de procesos participativos, aprendizaje recíproco y horizontal, que es lo que les decía, que no hay una jerarquía aquí, y basado en un enfoque de aprender haciendo. O sea, así se hace, así lo hacemos. Ya vemos los resultados y de acuerdo a esto lo apropiamos y lo seguimos haciendo. Este proceso se da durante 3 años y de acuerdo al tipo de módulos productivos que tiene cada uno, la frecuencia de visitas y avances se va dando en función a los hitos que se han marcado de manera participativa con cada uno de ellos, marcando tareas específicas y logros que deben tener a fechas determinadas. Cada yachachi aproximadamente tiene alrededor entre 30 a 35 familias a su cargo, y cada núcleo ejecutor está más o menos alrededor de 400 familias, y un coordinador de este núcleo ejecutor tiene un promedio de 10 yachachis a 12 yachachis a su cargo, dependiendo de las zonas a donde van a desarrollarse. El proceso y el contenido mínimo de la asistencia técnica que se da a los yachachis es clave. O sea, como les dije, son campesinos de las zonas que tienen conocimiento, saben transmitir el conocimiento de manera práctica, no sentados en un salón para dar una clase, sino de manera práctica, pero necesitamos fortalecer sus capacidades de transmisión de conocimientos. Entonces generamos una serie de actividades para fortalecer sus capacidades, para tratar de homogeneizar los niveles de conocimiento de las distintas tecnologías que van a trabajar con cada uno de los usuarios, sobre todo en la vivienda productiva, para hacer cambios radicales en la vivienda. Si ustedes ven esta foto de acá, por ejemplo, es una foto posterior. Si ustedes lo hubieran visto anteriormente, este era un ambiente lúgubre, lleno de hollín negro y con 3 piedritas acá donde se metía la leña y se hacía la cocción de los alimentos. Ahora ustedes pueden ver que hasta tienen figuritas, dibujos, etcétera, que son cuestiones espontáneas que van generando y van mostrando un poco el nuevo cambio de vida, la alegría que es de llegar a su casa para poder disfrutar de ella y también de sus activos productivos de una manera
Carlos,
más efectiva.
apologies to interrupt. Would you mind going through the last 2 slides with some more speed so we can have enough time for questions and discussion?
Sí, correcto. Esta es la última diapositiva. Bien, entonces, una de las cosas que me pidieron es un poco explicar cómo se ha podido hacer el escalamiento. Este es un programa nacional que nosotros lo desarrollamos a nivel de todos los departamentos de nuestro país, y para eso lo que hemos utilizado es una fortaleza del modelo. Como ustedes pueden haber entendido, este modelo se desarrolla por la misma comunidad. Entonces, el desarrollar en distintas comunidades a nivel nacional es el desarrollo atomizado de cada uno de estos núcleos ejecutores. Pero si no hay un control, un seguimiento, una trazabilidad de todo lo que se hace, difícilmente podemos tener la certeza de que se van a lograr los efectos para los que está diseñado el programa. Entonces, tenemos herramientas tecnológicas que nos permiten recoger desde el diseño de la intervención, qué cosa es lo que se está diseñando, qué actividades son las que se van a hacer, qué activos son los que se necesitan comprar, bienes, servicios, a quiénes se tienen que contratar para desarrollar, cómo va el desarrollo de cada uno de estos procesos a lo largo del desarrollo de este tema, darle fortalecimiento de capacidades básicas mínimas digitales a los yachachis para que ellos mismos sean los que vayan registrando con fotografías georreferenciadas en las fechas de las visitas y los avances de las capacitaciones, los trabajos que se van realizando en cada uno de estos módulos. Y esto, que lo tenemos en una gran base de datos, nos permite tener información básica para que nosotros, a través de nuestras unidades territoriales que las tenemos a nivel nacional, podamos hacer una supervisión robusta, orientada, digamos, específicamente a las zonas donde hay problemas en la ejecución o donde están las mejores ejecuciones. Unas para corregir y otras para incorporar y mejorar de repente experiencias exitosas. Una de las ventajas que tiene este programa es que como es un desarrollo, digamos, participativo y va con la línea de la necesidad de la localidad, permite generar experiencias exitosas que pueden ser desarrolladas en otras zonas, y también implica que dentro del desarrollo de este tema nosotros tenemos mucha innovación. Innovaciones básicas, mínimas, que parecen que pudieran ser normales y naturales, pero generan un cambio increíble en lo que es la producción, la productividad y la calidad de productos. Y sobre todo un tema clave aquí es que nosotros trabajamos con ellos competencias que les permitan ser actores directos en los mercados y no ser sujetos de intermediarios que lo que hacen es desbaratarles todos los procesos económicos que tienen a través de precios que no son los justos, que ni siquiera dan al nivel mínimo del costo de producción. Y en líneas generales, la supervisión robusta, digamos, la trazabilidad que tenemos, el compromiso de cada uno de los usuarios, el hecho de tener yachachis fortalecidos, que en este momento tenemos 3.000 en campo, pero hasta el momento ya hemos trabajado con más de 11.000 yachachis, y con un proceso de certificación de estos yachachis que estamos haciendo a través de una entidad competente y Foncodes, que ya es una entidad certificadora, estamos generando también estas competencias no solo para los proyectos de Foncodes, sino que en los municipios donde nosotros desarrollamos, quedan estos yachachis para que puedan seguir brindando servicios a toda la población, a todos los agricultores de la agricultura familiar de la zona que necesitan mejorar sus condiciones de vida o atender algunas necesidades básicas de plagas, técnicas, etcétera, situaciones específicas que les permita de alguna manera ir mejorando sus condiciones de vida. Con esto logramos ese cambio de chip de resignación a un cambio de chip de desarrollo y actor activo del desarrollo económico de las localidades, pero no solo del desarrollo de la economía básica, sino también de las condiciones de vida. Bueno, eso es un poco lo que puedo compartir con ustedes en este corto tiempo. Creo que me he excedido un poco el tiempo porque soy muy apasionado con el tema, pero muchas gracias por la invitación y atento a las preguntas que ustedes tengan a bien hacerme, con todo gusto. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Carlos. That was really interesting, and your passion came out really strongly from the presentation. There are lots of questions in the chat box, and the first question I'm going to ask links to your presentation and the very interesting model of the Yachachik and also the horizontal way of working, the farmer-to-farmer methodology. And this is picking up on a question that was posted in the chat box by Mdisa about Ethiopia's PSMP program, where he says, PSMP is planning to deploy young community facilitators to play the role of coaches and mentors. But we are not sure if these youth can actually coach or mentor older farmers. And so he asks, what is more important, the age of mentors or their knowledge or skill, presumably from an education they've received? So I'd like to ask this question actually to all three panelists, so to open up the conversation. But Carlos, since you were presenting on this farmer-to-farmer methodology, what is your opinion on the question, what is more important, the age and life experience or knowledge and skill as taught through an education and through school possibly?
¿Me permiten contestar primero? Muy interesante la pregunta. Pero la pregunta está ligada a un proceso, digamos, más convencional. Nuestro proceso no es convencional. Entonces, no ligamos nosotros a la edad de la persona que lo va a transmitir. Podría ser muy joven o muy adulto. Lo que necesitamos es que tenga capacidad de transmitir el conocimiento haciendo las cosas. O sea, experiencia en conocer hacer las cosas, pero también esa capacidad de poder hacer empatía con la persona para poder decirle, acercarle y decirle, mira, hagamos esto, hagamos lo otro. Y mira, lo vamos a hacer así, repítelo así, pon tu mano acá, jala acá, chapa esta palana de aquí, etc. Y eso también nos permite a nosotros haber diseñado este sistema de certificación de yachachis, para que estas personas que no tienen estudios puedan tener una certificación del Ministerio de Educación, que es una certificación, digamos, productiva. Y una cosa que me olvidé de decirles, todos son remunerados, o sea, son contratados para desarrollar este trabajo remunerado, ¿no?
Thank you so much for that response, Carlos. Can I invite Kaushik and Claudine as well to reflect on the question about what skills coaches and mentors require, but especially the difference between what life experience brings as well as skills that are maybe transferred through formal education, and especially thinking about the different capacity requirements of the coaches that are involved in your interventions. Kaushik, would you like to respond first?
Yes, like definitely, like Carlos mentioned that skills and knowledge is very important. Age is not a factor. So definitely the coaches who have that compassion, who have that energy of learning. So basically, like when I mentioned in my presentation also that while you are selecting these coaches, so that is very important thing, that you need to select the right coaches. So like, it's not that selecting the coaches and then building the capacity. So you have to check slowly that within the community, like in our program, we initially start working with these families, with the participants, and see there are many youths or any type of people who are engaging, showing their interest and energy. And slowly these are the persons who owns the things and who has a vision, and we also develop further vision that they will contribute to the development of the community. So these are the basic requirements, and based on that we coach them and we mentor them, we build their capacity. So initially there should be some urge from the community, And we used to definitely JSLPS used to see that these volunteers in the initial stage, they eventually turn up to be coaches. So even we call them smart coaches. So it's not definitely about the age. And with the youths, like in our program, we have specially worked with the youth. Mostly our the change makers, they are youths. We have seen an immense impact. The youths are very energetic, and they engage very easily with the participants. Even with the male youths, there has been a lot of issues that the male youths cannot engage closely with the women participants. But if you have that ownership and you have that compassion, then definitely they can achieve everything. And that's why we work more on the soft skills part of the life skills, where we teach them about their identity, about empathy, about values and decision making, about ownership, and like about leadership and team building, coordination. These things we used to coach them, and we used to build the capacity, which eventually we have seen that this the youth coaches definitely work. But definitely this is in context of the PVTGs, because they are vulnerable communities, they live in remote areas. So thank you.
Thank you, Kaushik. It's very interesting to hear your perspective. And Claudine, can I ask you for your perspective? Also, having heard from you before that one of the requirements to become a parasocial worker is to be a champion and to have evidence that there was success in life. So how do you see the role of having valuable life experience and certain skills that may have come through formal education or capacity building?
Thank you, Katie, sorry. I think when Janet introduced, she came she explained the difference between coaches and mentors. And I think that is where we have an important difference between the two. Where the coaches are there to advise, to work on the behavior, to make a close follow-up, while the mentors are working on the sustainable livelihoods enhancement, being able to develop a livelihood project, etc. So our parasocial workers combine the two. They are coaches, they are also mentors. And for that purpose, of course, there is the minimum requirement of having the primary education, but also the capacity building that we are providing them with is mainly on helping them to understand the program. So when we talk about the graduation, what do we mean? What are the key elements? What are the approaches that are used? What are the opportunities existing in the community, etc.? So them to understand the program. Then it is also important that we help them to understand their roles. So once the program is understood, what role are they going to play? What methodology are going to use? So we developed the guidelines for them, and those guidelines are actually helping even people, stakeholders, which are not non-government, so being international NGOs, civil society organizations, to use those guidelines while they are providing capacities to our parasocial workers, while they are giving them the responsibilities, while helping them to understand the interventions at the community level where those NGOs are working. So those two are really important. And what you talked about, the formal education versus the life experience, I think the two complement each other. Of course, they have the minimum knowledge, but also the experience shapes them, and they can understand where it went well, where it didn't go well, and how they can advise, very on the job and the development of livelihood projects. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I would like to pick up then on another question from the chat box. And that's a question from Sonia Sultan, who asks about the engagement of coaches from their own communities. And I believe this is the case in all three interventions that were presented, where coaches are recruited from the same community, as was explained, because they know the context and they're presumably better able to connect with community members. But Sonia asks, are they therefore not likely to also suffer from some of the same social prejudices that might exist? And would they be able to present or share new ideas to sort of think out of the box, if you will? She asked, does an outsider provide, or can they provide certain benefits in terms of not being biased, but also some sort of distance from the community that might actually be quite helpful in terms of coaching? Kaushik, you are on my screen, so I will ask you first if you want to respond, and then ask if any of the other presenters would like to respond to this.
Yes, thank you, Katie. So like our experience have been, again, in context of PBTGs, definitely within the community, it works. It works within the community because they have much more acceptance. And we have, to be very honest, we have seen this biasness, but they are not so high, because at the initial stage, they have lack of understanding. But when slowly they are being capacitated and they build their own vision of community development, they understand that what is their role as change makers, how they're going to change their community. So it's not like taking biased decisions. They think of the whole community, and specifically with the PVTGs, they have very much cohesiveness between them. They think of their community that is very, very specific for the tribals. Like in the advanced groups, we have seen that there are biasness who are not tribal, the scheduled caste, or even the ultra poors. But within the tribals, that is an experience in India. We have experienced that they're not biased. That is a positive thing. And definitely, the coaches, as I rightly mentioned before, that we also build their vision, how to own the community, and how to, through these different capacity building sessions, how they will gain the knowledge and they will serve back to the society and contribute for the development of the own community. So definitely we have seen that coaches from the community, it definitely works and it gives results. But sometimes there are some situations where we see, it's, to be very honest, we see that these coaches are a little bit biased, but the percentage is not so high. So basically we come to the conclusion that from the community, it works well rather than from an outsider. And in the rural context, definitely, if an outsider comes and serves, he doesn't understand the context, he doesn't understand the culture, the heritage of that community. So it takes time to understand their culture, heritage, their language. They have different language. So even like the staffs of JSLPS and our staffs of Trickle Up, they have still not been able to understand or interpret the whole language. That is also a basic barrier. So community coaches are better in this context. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaushik. Claudine, could I ask you to respond? You spoke about this, the special context that you operate in, and the history that creates the opportunity to work within communities in a way. How do you feel about this question about having parasocial workers from within the community versus outside of the community?
It is important for us to have parasocial workers from the community for the trust, for knowing and understanding the context, for the relationships. So I think when the parasocial workers are coming from the community, they are more efficient and they can really do the work because they understand the whole context, but also the fact that they can live the living conditions. They share the same values, the same challenges, they face the same issues. So we found that they become more efficient. And for the other questions related to the incentives being it high or less. We have that chance that people accept to work as community volunteers. And the most important is the recognition, even some recognition not involving money, like for instance, the fact that they are known, they are recognized in the community, they are being given certificates, there are some celebration to say thank you for what you did, etc. So these are important, of course, for them to be able to become operational. It is important when you can provide the communication fees, when, for instance, you can pay like mutuelle de santé, this is the community health insurance, when you can also provide some fees for their transport, and of course, it gives motivation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudine. So yes, that's really helpful response to other questions that were asked in the chat box about whether there is a risk of overburdening community members, community workers, especially if they do this work as volunteers. And it's helpful to hear you say that the incentives that you give should be able to offset some of those concerns and should be allowing workers to do their work with enthusiasm and passion. But of course, there are questions around overburdening coaches. And another question by Jason just now in the chat box asks about monitoring and accountability, or holding coaches to account, and how can that be done without too much reporting requirements? And this also links to a question that Ezra asked earlier about how to monitor and measure effectiveness of coaching. Carlos, can I ask you, how do you see this issue of potentially overburdening, in your case, the Yachachik, and how to keep them motivated and how to find the right balance between asking them to do the in-depth work with the farmers, as well as reporting and all the technical elements that come with implementing this kind of program?
Bien, muchas gracias, Katie. En primer lugar, no hay sobrecarga porque la carga está establecida por nosotros. No puede haber más de 30 o 40 y eso depende del distanciamiento en el que se encuentran cada una de las familias o las parcelas donde se desarrolla. Entonces, ese problema de sobrecarga no existe. El control y seguimiento, como les dije, tiene un proceso de supervisión, pero que a la vez va ligado de un sistema que nos permite hacer la trazabilidad georreferenciada a través de fotografías y avances de todo lo que se va haciendo en cada uno de los hogares, y que a través de visitas que se hacen de supervisión se corroboran estos avances. Y el otro tema clave es la rendición de cuentas doble que les indiqué. Una rendición de cuentas públicas donde ellos públicamente tienen que rendir cuentas a cada usuario en qué se ha invertido cada sol y cuál es el nivel de avance de lo que se está haciendo en cada una de las parcelas de los que están participando en la reunión. Entonces no les pueden mentir, no le pueden decir, ya he comprado una motobomba para el señor Juan Pérez, cuando el señor Juan Pérez está ahí, dice, a mí no me ha llegado ninguna motobomba. Y la asamblea es autónoma, puede descabezar o destituir a este grupo que dirige el núcleo ejecutor, porque ellos son los que los han elegido y pueden también cambiarlos. Y adicionalmente tenemos este otro proceso de rendición de cuentas administrativa que la hacen a FONCODES, donde tienen que sustentar todos los gastos que se han desarrollado. Adicionalmente, quisiera un poquito irme a la pregunta anterior también, porque es clave el tema, que sí es bueno que sean de la zona, pero el proceso de contratación lo hacen ellos. A veces es excelente que vaya una persona que es de la zona porque tiene mucha ascendencia, pero a veces hay gente que conoce en la zona pero no tiene mucha ascendencia. Y el proceso de contratación lo hace el mismo núcleo ejecutor a través de un proceso abierto, público, donde eligen a los Yachachi. La condición es que vivan en la zona durante todo el tiempo de permanencia que van a tener. Pero hay un tema que no lo indiqué. Cada 3 meses, los contratos son cada 3 meses. Y para poder renovar esos contratos necesitan pasar por un proceso de evaluación. Y ese proceso de evaluación es compartido con FONCODES y el núcleo ejecutor.
Thank you so much, Carlos. There is much more that we could discuss, but unfortunately, we are coming towards the end of this session, and I have been reminded that we have a Zoom poll that we would like you to respond to. So there are two questions. First of all, could you please indicate with the question that's coming onto the screen now, to what extent you agree or disagree, and that's the question about whether you would use ideas and materials from this session for future work in this area. And I can see the answers being entered now. And the second question is, would you recommend this series of webinars to your colleagues? So please take a moment to provide your answers. Before I end with some very few short final remarks. Let me end the poll here. So this has been a really exciting session. 3 great presentations, plus of course Janet's framing presentation. And 3 very interesting models of coaching. And there are a few things that struck me in terms of similarities, issues, and then things we haven't heard so much about that maybe we can use for a follow-up conversation. So the first thing that struck me across all 3 presentations is that coaches are real champions. They do a lot of really important work in the communities and with participants in the programs. They have a lot of hard skills, even though I appreciate there is a difference between coaching, training, and mentoring. Listening at the 3 different interventions, there's quite a lot of overlap between those roles. And so there is skills when it comes to farming technology, for example, or income generating activities. So a lot of hard skills that they have and are transferring, but also a focus on soft skills. We heard Kaushik talk about compassion, the ability to empathize. We heard from Rwanda how there needs to be an example of success in life, etc. So it's really quite an ask from coaches to deliver all this. And so I think it does speak to a tension between going to scale and using the resources to reach as many people as possible versus really in-depth engagement, meeting people where they are and being able to respond to household and their members' needs in the best way possible. And I think some of the questions in this chat box also reflected on this, and a particular concern or challenge around engaging people as volunteers, and whether that's the best model to be effective, both for participants as well as for coaches themselves. Something that we didn't speak so much about today was the individual versus group coaching. So the examples we heard were primarily on individual coaching. We heard a little less about the opportunities to do coaching in groups. I know there's various interventions. There are testing models. There's also some evidence that suggests that group coaching can be quite effective. So it will be very interesting to hear more from other models that operate that kind of coaching. And I think that would be my very last remark for this session, is that although coaching is integrated in 90% of all programs, there is a wide diversity in terms of how coaching is implemented, what different kinds of models are used, the skills of coaches, how they are incentivized or paid, and also how they interact with the program participants. So I would say definitely watch this space. I very much enjoyed the conversation. I would like to thank all the speakers and of course also all participants in this conversation. And like I said, this is the final one for this calendar year, but please do join us again in 2023 for the first one in February. Thank you very much.